Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to John Adams and the New Nation, an online professional development webinar from America in Class from the National Humanities Center. My name is Richard Schramm. I'm the Vice President for Education Programs at the Humanities Center, and I'll be moderating this evening's session. Before we get underway, I just want to point out our new introductory video that you can find on our website and in the emails we send you, and on the forum as well. I hope you had a chance to look at it, but if you didn't, let me just say that the National Humanities Center is an institute for advanced study located in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. Our main mission is a fellowship program that brings scholars to the center for an academic year to research and write on topics in subjects like history, literature and language studies, philosophy, and criticism of the arts. We have for a long time run a vigorous outreach program to teachers, and you folks have discovered our webinars. We also offer a rich array of resources for teachers of American history and literature. And you can find all of those resources by going to americainclass.org. When you do, if you click on America in Class Lessons and scroll down to this one, Citizen Leadership in the Young Republic, the Father-Son Letters of John Adams and John Quincy Adams, you will find this evening's material outlined for you in a classroom-ready lesson. You'll find fine-grained, text-dependent close reading questions, and we provide responses for teachers in a teacher's guide. You'll find a printable worksheet for use with students, but you'll also find interactive exercises which provide you with a new and innovative way to study complex texts. Please take a look at that along with our other lessons. We are really developing several more interactive lessons, and I think when you see them, you'll discover an innovative way to teach primary documents. Now, after the seminar this evening, please go to the seminar website. There you'll find a recording, the PowerPoint presentation, and please, if you want to plunder the PowerPoint presentation for any of your classes, do that. You will also find an evaluation. We ask you to please complete that evaluation. You can do it online and just flash it off to us. Once we have received your evaluation, then you'll be able to download documentation of participation, which you will be able then to present to your local certifying authority for whatever recertification credit this seminar would warrant. Now, how to participate in this evening's discussion? Well, we'll be making remarks key to our seminar presentation, excerpts from the letters. From time to time, we'll stop to ask a discussion question. To respond, put your cursor in the green box that I bracketed there, type your response, hit the send button to the right, your message will appear on the top, and then I will be following that chat very closely and bringing your comments and questions into the discussion at appropriate moments. We hope to respond to our questions, and we hope you will ask questions or make comments of your own. We hope you'll share how you identify a passage to use with students, share how you present and teach the material, and share a potential project or assignment you see in the material. Please do not hesitate to participate in the chat. Don't just confine yourself to responding to our questions. Pose your own questions and comments. The more you participate, the better the webinar. Some of you have already participated by presenting us with some really interesting questions in the seminar form, and we will be addressing these as we go through the program tonight. What can we learn from the letters about both Adams's Federalist ideologies and their thoughts on the duties of the citizen in the new republic? What can we learn about John Quincy Adams's philosophical development and its effect on the young nation? And John Adams seems more like an afterthought to Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. How can we make him more central to the founding narrative? We also have two questions of our own that we're going to address this evening. What do these letters tell us about the state of the new republic? And what do they tell us about the kind of leadership the founders thought was necessary to govern this new nation? To lead us through those questions, we're very pleased to have with us Scott E. Casper, professor of history at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, where he is also the dean of the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. Recently, Scott was a fellow of the National Humanities Center, where he worked on that second book that he published in 2008, Sarah Johnson's Mount Vernon, The Forgotten History of an American Shrine. Since then, he has edited the Oxford Encyclopedia of American Cultural and Intellectual History, and before that, he wrote Constructing American Lives, Biography, and Culture in 19th Century America. So let me unmute Scott's microphone. He's ready to go. Scott, it's all yours.
Thank you, Richard. Welcome to all of you. It's great to be with you. I'm so glad you're part of this seminar through the National Humanities Center. What we're going to do tonight is first talk a bit about what you do when you use letters in the classroom. How do you teach with letters? Then we're going to dig in and spend some time with a number of the letters back and forth between John Adams and John Quincy Adams. So to get started, let's just ask a few questions. How do you use letters in your classroom? What questions do you want your students to answer when they're reading letters? And what challenges do you foresee in using letters? And we can talk a bit about that. If you want to type in some responses in the discussion board in the chat room, that would be great. While we're doing that, maybe I'll say a bit about letters themselves. One of the challenges, of course, is that in the 18th century, many people in America, as in Europe, didn't write letters. And we have to wonder whose letters even survived. So we are more likely to have letters, for example, from the Adamses than we are from an ordinary farm family that lived in Western Massachusetts, who, even if they wrote letters, it's a good question whether those letters would be with us still today. See that many people are typing. I think.
Okay, we have here one of the challenges of using letters like this is that the students have a difficult time understanding the language. Another person, when it comes to the challenges, especially with letters like these, the language they sometimes use is hard for my students to understand. That 18th century prose, Scott, is really tough.
It is. And I think what we just have here on the discussion board just now, Mike says he usually provides a reading guide for 7th graders to get them focused. Then we discuss as a group. Challenges are changes in written language over time. Exactly. One of my favorite questions in teaching is simply, huh? That is, what is somebody saying? How can we translate this into English that we understand? As teachers, part of what we can do is think in advance, obviously, about what words would be difficult, what ideas and phrases would be difficult, even excerpting, figuring out which sentences we really want students to focus on, because a letter can be long, and that just makes it more difficult to know exactly what we think is important. So a reading guide is very useful. Handwriting and spelling, I agree, Judith, can be very, very challenging. One approach could be to show the students the original letter, or a copy of the original letter, but also have a transcription for them so that they can get a sense of what the handwriting looked like, but you're not spending as much time in class just trying to decipher it. It is challenging sometimes to work with those original documents, but the combination of the Xerox of the original or the transcription of the original gives you the best of both worlds. It is fun to get your hands on something that looks like it was written in the past, as opposed to just the typed version. I think that Mike's point here, that using letters can be useful by helping students understand how things were back then, I think it's true. And great point, students today should write more letters. We don't, it seems to be a lost art. We have email, but email is much less formal than letters in the 18th century often were. Certainly, picking up on Anthony's point here, close reading, close analysis of documents is crucial to the Common Core. Letters are a good example of that kind of document. It's always useful to remember whose letters we're looking at. I'm going to go ahead and move us to the next slide here. Please feel free to keep weighing in about the challenges of letters. As we do that, we'll introduce our correspondents for the evening, John Adams and John Quincy Adams. As you know, surely, John Adams was the second president of the United States. He was a crucial American from the period of the Continental Congresses in the 1770s through his time as president from 1797 to 1801. He's also well known for work between those dates, work as a diplomat, his education as a lawyer. Some of you may know that at the time of the Boston Massacre, John Adams was the lawyer who stepped up to defend the British soldiers who had been accused of fomenting the massacre. So he was an attorney who was successful, he was very smart, and he was able to think about multiple sides of issues. The other thing to know about John Adams, I think, is we can describe him as cosmopolitan. when we think about colonial Americans in the 18th century, most rarely ventured beyond their own town. And of course, in the 18th century, most Americans, probably 80 or 90% of colonial Americans, were farmers. They didn't live in cities. We have a good question here about whether John Adams was born wealthy. I don't think so. I think that Adams was born certainly among to a comfortable family, but we're not talking about, say, a George Washington or a Thomas Jefferson, the Southern plantation owners who inherited large amounts of land from their parents. He also was not as wealthy, say, as a John Hancock, who was one of the leading merchants of Boston. Adams was certainly wealthy enough to own land, to attend Harvard, and to be able to participate in public service and leave his family for long periods of time and know that the family would be all right, which many farmers couldn't do. But he's not wealthy. He's not of the highest economic class. It's useful to know also that Adams's experience was much more urban than the experience of many 18th century Americans. He spent good bits of his life in Boston and, of course, later in Philadelphia during the period of the vice presidency and the first 3 years of his presidency. He traveled extensively in Western Europe, unlike most Americans of his period. So Adams is a cosmopolitan, he's an urban American, and he is a college-educated lawyer, which makes him very, very different from most Americans of his period. And it helps explain why his son would be different as well. His son is the son of this accomplished, educated man. And if anything, John Quincy Adams ended up being even better traveled than his father. John Quincy Adams, for example, went as far as Russia, as we will see over the course of tonight. So we have here two men who are not at all representative of Americans of the late 1700s. They are really more representative of a kind of New England educated elite. And let's get ourselves started with this letter, a fun letter, I think, because John Adams is writing this letter to his son, John Quincy, when John Quincy is just 8 years old. It's April 18th, 1776. So about 1 year after Lexington and Concord. Richard, do you want so we can dig in?
Okay. My dear son, I rejoice with you that our friends are once more in possession of the town of Boston, and am glad to hear that so little damage is done to our house. I hope you and your sister and brothers will take proper notice of these great events, and remember under whose wise and kind providence they are all conducted. Not a sparrow falls, not a hair is lost, but by the direction of infinite wisdom. Much less are cities conquered and evacuated. I hope that you will all remember how many losses, dangers, and inconveniences have been borne by our parents and the inhabitants of Boston in general for the sake of preserving freedom for you and yours. And I hope you will all follow the virtuous example if, in any future time, your country's liberties should be in danger and suffer every human evil rather than give them up. My love to your mama, your sister and brothers, and all the family, John Adams.
So what do you notice in this letter? Go ahead and type some ideas into the chat room. The first thing you notice, as we see here, is yes, God. So we have from the very beginning of the bold-faced parts, remember under whose wise and kind providence they are all conducted. Providence, the direction of infinite wisdom. Several references there to a higher power. So we have here John Adams certainly attributing some of what's going on to divine providence. What else do you notice? How they address each other. He doesn't sign this Dad. He doesn't sign it your father. He signs it John Adams. So I think, in fact, that that's not unusual in the 18th century. We
All right, we
also,
have another comment here. Adams writes to John Quincy as he would to an adult.
yeah, well put. Well put. This is a letter that I wonder today whether somebody would write this to an 8-year-old. But John Adams expects John Quincy Adams to have a certain degree of literacy. This would not be typical of 8-year-olds of the time, but maybe it was typical of John Quincy. We have a good
I have a
question.
question here, Scott. Was John Adams expecting people to read this letter, or did he expect it just to be read by his family?
He would have expected this to be read by his family, not just by John Quincy, but
Right.
potentially also by his wife Abigail, by their other children, if their other children could read and write at this point. It's worth noting, by the way, that John Adams is in Philadelphia when this letter is written. He's a delegate at the Second Continental Congress. John Quincy is home in Braintree, Massachusetts, which is where the family farm is. But it was quite typical for a letter to be circulated at least within the family. It's not a private letter between John and John Quincy. There's also,
Scott, maybe, excuse me, go ahead.
I think it's also worth noting what Adams might mean by your country's liberties toward the end of the bold-faced portion. That is, it's April 18th, 1776. What does John Adams mean when he says your country? Does he mean the United States, which don't even exist yet because the Declaration of Independence has not been ratified by Congress? Or does he perhaps mean your country as in Massachusetts, or your country as in the area around your home? It's an open question, I think.
We have a question here about the 18th century habit of capitalization. It was just an 18th century convention. They tended to capitalize nouns. Isn't that generally true?
It is. You see that in a number of letters from this period. You also see it at times in published documents. I think if you look at, for example, the original version of the Declaration of Independence, also 1776, many of the nouns in the Declaration of Independence were capitalized as well.
And we have another comment. The fact that he mentions damage to the Adams home makes it much more relatable and real for students. Good comment there for teaching.
That's a great point for teaching. Yeah, the more we can connect letters like this to students' own experience, I think that's useful. It makes it more able for students to relate to it, and then you can ask, once they've related to it, once they've found something in it that they can connect to, you can ask the next question: what's different about the 18th century than what we have today? For example, they're capitalizing nouns, or they're emphasizing divine providence, or for instance, the level of literacy that we see here. All of those things, people might say, oh, we wouldn't expect that today, or we wouldn't expect a father to sign his letter John Adams. So we're able to think about the similarities, but also the differences between then and now. How many children were in the family? That's a very good question. Let me see if I can remember that. I think that,
I think there are three, but I'm not sure.
I'm not sure either. We can try to track that down as we are working through tonight. I think there would have been at least four, because John Adams here refers to my love to your mama, your sister, and brothers, plural. So there's at least one sister and two brothers.
Right.
So at least four total. I wonder what he considers as human evil. I hope you will all follow the virtuous example if in any future time your country's liberties should be in danger, and suffer every human evil rather than give them up. What should people suffer rather than give up liberty? For example, maybe they should suffer warfare in order to protect liberty. That's one example. There you go. Death before surrender, Mike Jacobs writes, and I think that's a good example. Does it
Scott,
matter?
It might be worthwhile here. I don't want to take us off on a tangent or anything, but would it be fair to say that in the 18th century, people considered children just little adults? They didn't really consider children and childhood the way we think about it today.
That's very true, Richard. When you look at, for example, family portraits in the 18th century, you often see children dressed up as if they were little adults. You don't very often see children with toys and other playthings. That's much more a 19th century innovation. So yes, I think it's fair to say that children were seen as little adults. Children were also seen as potential participants in a family economy. The Adamses are not, they have a farm, but they're not dependent on their farm for making a living as most Americans of this period would have been. Children would have been involved in work from a very early age. Dave asks an interesting question here. Does it matter that Adams is referencing a Christian God when he is in Philly surrounded by so many deists? Did they bother him? Did he share any feelings about this with his son? Interestingly, I think in Philly, he probably was surrounded by even more Quakers than deists. And the Quakers would also have believed in a Christian God. I'm not sure that the deists bothered him, although he was not himself a deist. And the letters we're reading tonight and the letters that I've read between John and John Quincy Adams don't suggest a lot of discussion about religious doctrine, but I'm not familiar with all of their letters, so I wouldn't want to say for sure. Let's move to the next letter.
It appears, by the way, Scott, that John Adams had 6 children, 3 boys and 3 girls.
Okay. I wonder if all 6 of them were born at the time of these letters, because John Adams in that previous letter mentions your sister singular. So I wonder. Let's move to the next letter, because now we have little John Quincy, who's now, I believe, 9 years old, writing to his father, saying, "Dear Sir, I love to receive letters very well, much better than I love to write them. I make but a poor figure at composition. My head is much too fickle. My thoughts are running after birds' eggs, play, and trifles, till I get vexed with myself. Mamma has a troublesome task to keep me steady, and I own I am ashamed of myself. I have but just entered the 3rd volume of Smollett, though I had designed to have got it half through by this time. I have determined this week to be more diligent, as Mr. Thacker my resolution. I will write again at the end of the week and give a better account of myself. I wish, sir, you would give me some instructions with regard to my time and advise me how to proportion my studies and my play in writing, and I will keep them by me and endeavor to follow them. I am, dear sir, with a present determination of growing better yours, John Quincy Adams. P.S. Sir, if you will be so good as to favor me with a blank book, I will transcribe the most remarkable occurrences I met with in my reading, which will serve to fix them upon my mind." What do you notice here? Valerie writes, did he have ADHD? Well, nobody used that term then. It's very interesting to wonder. I wonder whether he really is as fickle as he says, or he is trying to live up to certain expectations that his well-educated, quite demanding father placed upon him. I think, Kelly, you make a very good point, striving to get his father's approval for his studies and everything else. I think that's certainly going on here. At the time, I believe John Quincy Adams was being tutored by this Mr. Thaxter. I've determined this week to be more diligent as Mr. Thaxter will be absent at court. That's his tutor or his private teacher. And so he can't pursue some studies, the things they would work with together. So instead, he is setting himself this goal of reading on his own. Yes, Dad, this was a very demanding father, I think it's fair to say. And John Quincy seems to want the guidance of that father. It's interesting, too, that John Quincy signs his full name. Little 9-year-old John Quincy Adams signs John Quincy Adams, not your son. And he refers to his father as dear sir. Again, not dad, not father, sir. So there's a formality about these letters, even though we see him as a kind of a little boy at the same time. When did he start formal lessons? I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me if he started formal lessons around the age of 5 or 6. His father and or mother might have been teaching him to read even earlier than that. It's also worth noting that in 18th century America, the ability to read was fairly widespread among native-born white New Englanders like John Quincy Adams, more widespread among boys than among girls, and that the ability to write was often taught later than the ability to read. So, for example, children might be taught to read when they're 5 or 6, but they're not taught to write yet. And if their education ends by the time they're 8 or 9, they might not know very much how to write at all. John Quincy Adams here, too, is somewhat the exception to that pattern.
Scott, is there any indication that perhaps his mother might have written this letter for him? I mean, he's 9 years old, undoubtedly smart and well educated for a 9-year-old, but the vocabulary here, vexed, fickle, troublesome. Any chance that Mama might have had a hand in this?
Maybe so. Although the fact that he's reading Smollett, and what he's reading here when he says the third volume of Smollett, this is Tobias Smollett, the English writer Tobias Smollett's 16-volume History of England. So the fact that we have this 9-year-old reading at that level suggests that he very well could have been writing this letter.
Yeah.
I wonder if some of the language here might have been his mother's language. My thoughts are running after birds' eggs. Is that really something may have had some role here, but this could very well have been written by John Quincy, given the level of his reading at this point.
Yeah, Smollett's a rough go.
It surprises me to think of a 9-year-old reading Smollett, even in the 18th century. So, shall we move to
Yes.
John's letter shortly thereafter? So, the end of the following month, John writes to his son, "My dear son, if it should be the design of Providence that you should live to grow up, you will naturally feel a curiosity to learn the history of the causes which have produced the late revolution of our government. No study in which you can engage will be more worthy of you. It will become you to make yourself master of all the considerable characters which have figured upon the stage of civil, political, or military life. This you ought to do with the utmost candor, benevolence, and impartiality, and if you should now and then meet with an incident which shall upon your father's character, I charge you to consider it with an attention only to truth. John Adams." What does he mean by characters and character here? We're going to be seeing those words a lot, so it's worth thinking about what 18th century English Americans, Euro Americans, meant when they talked about characters or character.
Okay. Any takers on that? It will become you to make yourself master of all the considerable characters which have figured upon the stage. He knew, well, this is questioning about the latter use of the word character. Adams knew that people would be writing about him, not all good things. So I think the participant here is suggesting that in this sense, the latter, the second use of character is one's virtue, one's reputation. And then perhaps the first use here, Mike Jacobs writes events, actions. Someone else speculated the founding fathers, leading figures. Maybe character means persons and character means personality. Good division.
Mm-hmm. I think you're moving, many of you are moving toward a very important distinction. When we talk about somebody's character today, we are often talking about private traits, private qualities, the things you see when you get to know somebody very well, maybe apart from their public life. In the 18th century, character was a much more public term than it is today in the 21st century. And what we see here in this letter is John Adams using the word character in two ways. The first, all the considerable characters which have figured upon the stage of civil, political, or military life. Characters would be public actors, public figures, And they could be leading figures, they could be figures who were involved in political life, or in religious life, and so on. But this would be public characters, and the term upon the stage is crucial here. When people talked about character in the 18th century, they often talked about individuals living their public lives as if they were characters on a stage. In other words, thinking about acting and thinking about presenting yourself in public. So we often see this idea of characters upon the stage of public life. So if the stage, the literal stage of theater is one kind of stage, another kind of stage might be Congress, another kind of stage might be the battlefield. And those are the places in which people exhibit their character and become themselves characters. And similarly, later on in this letter, when he says, shall meet with an incident which shall throw some light upon your father's character, same idea. That is, somebody might say something about John Adams, and that would be about John Adams as a or the truth of such remarks. John wants his son to focus on character, I think, because he expects that his son, like himself, will be a public figure at some point. Although I love the first line of this letter because in some ways it tells us a lot about the 18th century as well. If it should be the design of Providence that you should live to grow up, what is that telling us? What does that tell us about the 18th century? Lots of kids did not grow up to be adults. Child mortality was much greater in 18th century America than it is in 21st century America. So if God should favor you that you should be an adult, then you will be able to learn more and become a character yourself. As we move forward, just about 2 weeks, John writes to his son again, this time offering some very specific information about what young John Quincy ought to study. Richard, do you want to take this one?
My dear son, as the war in which your country is engaged will probably hereafter attract your attention more than it does at this time, and as the future circumstances of our country may require other wars as well as councils and negotiations similar to those which are now in agitation, I wish to turn your thoughts early to such studies as will afford you the most solid instruction and improvement for the part which may be allotted you to act on the stage of life. There is no history, perhaps, better adapted to this useful purpose than that of Thucydides, an author of whom I hope you will make yourself perfect master in original language, which is Greek, the most perfect of all human languages. In order to understand him fully in his own tongue, you must, however, take advantage of every help you can procure, and particularly of translations of him into your own mother tongue. I am with much affection your father, John Adams.
What do you notice about this letter? Susan asked, did people back then talk the same way as they wrote? Alas, we don't really know because we don't have recordings of their speech, obviously. I imagine that much of the way that people talked back then was less formal than their writing. I think people understood writing to be formal in a way that speech might not. I think also that speech within a family might be different from speech outside the family. It's a great question, though. Why does he refer to the United States as your country? Good question. The letter is more personal. I agree. I think we actually have here John Adams talking about John Quincy as my dear son, himself as your father, and expressing affection. I am with much affection your father. We haven't seen that in the previous letters. I wonder about your country, whether John Adams might be suggesting that you too need to own this country, right? It's not just that I am leading the fight for independence here in Congress. It's also that it's your country too, and that you should imagine it as that. Remember that this is just the first, but basically a little more than a year after the Declaration of Independence. People still are coming to understand this United States as a country. he is indeed directing his son to know history. He seems to think that history is the best training for leadership in the future. And I think you're absolutely right. The last comment here, that he has a sense that his son is destined either for greatness or at least for public life. And I like here that he says, which may be allotted to you, for the part which may be allotted to you to act on the stage of life. Here's that language again of actors upon a stage. And for the stage that John Quincy will occupy, or at least that his father hopes he will occupy, he needs to know history. He also needs to know Greek. Ah, interesting question, Susan. Did he prefer Greek over Latin because Greek was associated with the Catholic, I'm sorry, because Latin was associated with the Catholic Church? I wonder about that. I think Latin, although Latin was certainly associated with the Catholic Church, it was also associated with higher learning and language. I'm not sure why he calls Greek the most perfect of all human languages. In fact, the New Testament was in Greek. Okay, yeah. Interestingly, this. Go ahead, Richard.
It's interesting here that he's having his son read Thucydides, and he opens this letter talking about war. His image of politics is one of conflict. He is preparing his son to deal with conflicts. It's no wonder. I mean, the country is at war right now, and that's going to be on everybody's minds. But he seems, and we'll see this in later letters, he seems to think that the world of politics is a world of conflict and stress.
And I think that for much of the previous 15 years before this letter, it certainly had been in New England. We see going back to 1765, the Stamp Act crisis, and even before that, the 7 Years' War, French and Indian War, which was certainly a major event for New England in the 1750s. I think John Adams's life had been one of a fair bit of political conflict for most of his own adulthood, and certainly all of John Quincy's young life. So that's a good point.
Yeah.
That the conflict is certainly part of their world.
The other thing that strikes me on this too is that this is a very classical education, as we'll see later on. He does study Latin and so on, but it's a classical education with a very practical end in mind to prepare him for leadership. So today we would consider this education, a lot of people would consider it a liberal arts degree and pretty well worthless, but not then. I mean, this classical education in the 18th century was practical preparation for public life. Is that fair to say?
I think it's fair to say that it's practical preparation for public life for people who are going to be entering into, say, politics and law. And I'm going to take us to the next letter because it's going to illuminate this even further. Here's John Quincy, and this is a few years later, writing to his father about his own work for the day. And this gives us a sense of the larger education that we're talking about here. My work for a day: make Latin, explain Cicero, Erasmus, Appendix, pierce Phaedrus, learn Greek, Racine's Greek grammar, geography, geometry, fractions, writing, drawing. And then he says, as a young boy cannot apply himself to all those things and keep a remembrance of them all, I should desire that you would let me know what of those I must begin upon at first. I am your dutiful son, John Quincy Adams. What do we get from this letter? What do we learn about little John Quincy, now 12?
Getting a very rigorous classical education, to be sure.
Mm-hmm. And I think that if he were destined, if his father had a sense that he was destined for life, say, as a merchant, the story would be very different. Fractions might be way more important than Latin for somebody who's going into life as a merchant. And yes, I think Kelly has a good point here that we learn that he is getting a great education. And as both Mike and Susan suggest, he's a little overwhelmed by this. Is he trying not to do everything he's supposed to? maybe so, but he cares. You're absolutely right, Susan. He's asking his father's opinion, and he respects that opinion. Um, so I also would note that where they are at this time, they're in France, both of them. John Adams is the U.S. minister to France. He's there to negotiate treaties of peace and commerce, and his son is with him there, living near Paris as a student. So we have here Latin and Greek. We have Erasmus, a Dutch philosopher, Phaedrus, who was a Greek philosopher. So we have philosophy, we have history, we have Greek and Latin, we have math, we have writing, we have drawing. And what does John Adams, in response, say that John Quincy should focus on? Here we have John Adams. Richard, you want to take this one?
My dear, my dear son, I have received your letter giving an account of your studies for a day. You should have dated your letter. I hope your master will soon put you into the Greek Testament, because the most perfect models of fine writing in history, oratory, and poetry are to be found in the Greek language. Writing and drawing are but amusements and may serve as relaxations from your studies. As for geography, geometry, and fractions, I hope your master will not insist upon spending much time upon them at present. My wish at present is that your principal attention should be directed to the Latin and Greek tongues, leaving the other studies to be thereafter attained in your own country. I am, my dear child, your affectionate father, John Adams. P.S. The next time you write to me, I hope you will take more care to write well. Can you keep a steadier hand?
Yes, and Mike loves the postscript on this letter. So do I. You have John Adams here as an affectionate father talking to John Quincy as my dear son and my dear child. And at the same time, he is teaching him, he's critiquing his letter writing. Write with better handwriting. You should have dated your letter, teaching him what belongs in a letter. So it's an interesting letter that combines affection with a certain amount of correction. And we also have here a sense of prioritizing what John Quincy ought to learn. So Greek and Latin rate higher than geography, geometry, and fractions. Were they not, Susan asks, why were they not living in the same household during this time? I wonder whether, for example, John Adams was traveling somewhere for diplomatic purposes at the time, and therefore John Quincy was not in the same household. They were writing to each other. This is another good reason why we don't have letters from lots of 18th century Americans. If they were not living apart, if parents and children were living in the same household, they wouldn't need to write letters to one another. This is a population that in certain ways is much less mobile than our population today. So we have here certain priorities, which again remind us that this is a family that is interested in diplomacy. It's interested in public leadership in a world that might be different from the ordinary farmer, who would not need to know Greek or Latin and probably would not have the leisure time to do so either.
Scott, let me ask a question. How widespread among the elite was that sense that was the attempt to groom children for public service? Was that a widespread proclivity, or limited just a few, or do we know?
I think it is a relative few. I think the question is what we mean by public service. So, for example, how many people thought of grooming their children for political and diplomatic leadership? Probably quite few. How many people thought of grooming their children to be ministers? That is religious leaders. Probably slightly more. How many people thought of grooming their children to be merchants? Probably more than that. So I think that when we think about the professions, that there's a difference between professions that people could study in order to become educated, respected citizens, and then separately the profession of political leadership, which would have been imaginable to fewer people. particularly this kind of leadership, this leadership that comes through Greek and Latin.
Mhm.
I don't think that's quite as widespread.
Yeah, throughout these letters, I'm struck by that sense of uh, deliberate grooming for a particular path in life. I mean, he knows that his son is going to have a public life, and he's setting him definitely on that track.
I think that's absolutely true. And you know, assuming he lives to be that long, then it might happen, right? But it's worth noting that of John and John Quincy Adams's I'm sorry, of John and Abigail Adams's 6 children, John Quincy is the one who achieves that kind of public life. So even within a family like this, not all of the children, not even all of the male children, are trained for this kind of life. Even within a family, there might be distinctions between the child who is groomed for, say, political leadership, and maybe another child will be groomed for the ministry, and so on. Let's go on to a letter from John to John Quincy later in the following year. It's now December of 1781, and John writes to John Quincy, "My dear son, your letter of 21 August OS, 1 September 1781 NS, the first I have received, reached me only 2 or 3 days ago. I am pleased to see your handwriting improve as well as your judgment ripen as you travel. Make it a rule, my dear son, to lose no time. There is not a moral precept of clearer obligation or of greater import. Make it the grand maxim of your life, and it cannot fail to be happy and useful to the world. Write me often. Let me know the state of education and letters in St. Petersburg. Pray, do you hear anything of a passage by land from Russia to America? What discoveries have been made?" It might be worth noting where they are during this letter. John Adams is in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, where he's the U.S. Commissioner to the Netherlands to negotiate loans to the United States and a commerce treaty. We're still during the Revolution. This is after the Battle of Yorktown, so we think of it as the unofficial end or the last major battle of the Revolution, but the treaty has not been signed yet, and now the United States is trying to negotiate treaties of commerce with other European nations. So John's in Amsterdam, and John Quincy is in Russia, of all places. He's at St. Petersburg, where he is secretary to the United States minister to Russia, Francis Dana. So John Quincy, at this point, has gone even beyond where his father has gone. He's traveled much further than John Adams, all the way to St. Petersburg, and clearly others recognize John Quincy's potential because he's off in Russia as a secretary at age 14 to a fairly significant figure. Susan writes that she's struck by the fact that at that age JQA had such an important position. I'm struck by it too. Highly unusual for a 14-year-old. Certainly, 14 was older in 1781 than it is now in many ways. 14-year-olds in a farm family would be shouldering a fair amount of responsibility for the farm. Here, we have a 14-year-old who's involved in the diplomatic relations between the United States and Russia. And Judith makes the very good point that we have now begun to see a shift in the relationship between John and John Quincy. Now John is asking for John Quincy's observations because John Quincy is in a place that John has never been and may never go. What are things like in Russia? What are education and literature like in Russia? And he's asking this old question about a land passage between Russia and America. How might people have gotten from Russia to America? Is it possible that the western part of North America was populated by people who came overland from Russia? So we have here John now recognizing John Quincy as possibly the bearer or repository of knowledge beyond what John might have. I want to mention one more thing about this letter, which you might see as you're looking at letters from the 18th century. At the very beginning, when John says, "Your letter of 21 August OS, 1 September 1781 NS, they're referring to the change from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar, which happened in much of Europe and in America in the first half of the 18th century. It's a different way of measuring time, of counting the calendar, and so he's referring to both of those. And those are the references. I think actually Mike asks a good question. I think the reference here to 21 August old style is probably what was in the letter, and then some editor has added 1 September 1781 new style. Okay, so
we have a question. We have a question. How long did they continue to refer to both? And if that one, the September 1st, 1781 new style, was put in by an editor, probably, well, I don't know. How long did they continue to use both?
I have not seen this very often in letters as late as 1781, because the transition occurred back in the 1750s in Britain and America. So by this point, most people in America, I think, would have been using the new style. So it's unclear to me why John would use old style here in this letter. And certainly by the time you get to the 19th century, you don't see this at all.
Mm-hmm. Right.
As we move forward to 1783, this is in May 1783. Now John is back in Paris, where he is part of the commission negotiating the final peace treaty with Great Britain. This is the treaty that will officially end the Revolutionary War. And John Quincy is now in the Netherlands at The Hague. So they are still both in Europe, and they're in different places again. And John begins the letter. My dear child, I see your travels have been expensive, as I expected they would be, but I hope your improvements have been worth the money. Have you kept a regular journal? If you have not, you will be likely to forget most of the observations you have made. If you have omitted this useful exercise, let me advise you to recommence it immediately. Let it be your amusement that is, to record in minute detail every day whatever you may have seen or heard worth notice. One contracts a fondness for writing by use. We learn to write readily, and what is of more importance, we think and improve our judgments by committing our thoughts to paper. A regular distribution of importance. You must measure out your hours for study, meals, amusements, exercise, and sleep, and suffer nothing to divert you. And Mike writes in here, time management and focus. Oh yes, this is all about time management and focus. And I agree, Susan. This is very useful advice 231 years later. If we can encourage our students to write frequently, and that's part of Common Core, of course, then our students will learn to write better and better just by writing more and more, and maybe also think better as well. Certainly at this point, and I think Kelly makes a very good point here, John Adams recognizes that he is a public figure and that their family are public figures, and therefore what they are writing is more likely to be passed down through the generations than many people's writing would be. So he's emphasizing writing. A correspondence that we don't have here, but that you can easily look up, is the correspondence between John Adams and Abigail Adams. Fascinating correspondence that also gives you the sense of two people writing to each other and knowing, in some sense, that their letters are going to be preserved, that their letters matter in some historical way. This is definitely about discipline, it's definitely about order, and it's definitely about a method of gaining knowledge and capturing what you have learned. This letter goes on to say, but above all things, my son, take care of your behavior and preserve the character you have acquired for prudence and solidity. Remember your tender years and treat all the world with modesty, decency, and respect. Be as frugal as possible in your expenses. Everybody gives me a very flattering character of your sister, and I am well pleased with what I hear of you. The principal satisfaction I can expect in life in future will be in your good behavior and that of my other children. My hopes from all of you are very agreeable. God grant I may not be disappointed. Your affectionate father, John Adams. So back to that idea of character here, the character you have acquired. In a sense, here character refers to what? Reputation, right? You have acquired a certain reputation for being prudent and solid, for being, in other words, thoughtful and deliberate. Everybody gives me a very flattering character of your sister. In a sense, maybe John Adams in Paris is hearing in letters from people back in the United States that John Quincy's sister is also a prudent, modest person. So we have this language again of character, of how people behave and act, especially in public settings. Let's move several years forward to 1786. John Quincy is now 18 years old. So he's now pretty much close to adulthood. Richard, do you want to read this to us and we'll talk about where John Quincy is in his education at this point?
Certainly. My dear son, give me leave to congratulate you on your admission into the seat of the Muses, our dear alma mater, where I hope you will find a pleasure and improvements equal to your expectations. You are now among magistrates and ministers, legislators and heroes, ambassadors and generals. I mean, among persons who will live to act in all these characters. If you pursue your studies and preserve your health, you will have as good a chance as most of them, and I hope you will take care to do nothing now which will in any future period have reason to recollect with shame or pain. I don't expect you to spend much of your time in writing to me, yet a short letter now and then will be indispensable to let me know how you do, what you want, and how you like. Inform yourself of the books possessed by private scholars and of studies they pursue. This you will find a valuable source of knowledge. But I must subscribe myself, your affectionate father, John Adams.
What do you notice about this letter? What's new, what's different about this letter from the ones we've seen before?
Okay.
Kelly suggests that John Adams seems very proud of his son and his accomplishments, and I think that's very much true here, congratulating him on getting into Harvard, which was, of course, John Adams's own alma mater. John Adams is releasing the reins. I think that's right. Earlier, John Adams was saying, you should write to me and telling him exactly how you should. Now he's saying, you don't need to write as much to me. You know, you're busy, you're studying. Every once in a while, could you write something? And exactly, Susan, before he encouraged John Quincy to write, now he doesn't. I think it is transitional. I think that he also knows, John Adams also knows that John Quincy is now in a different place with a different sort of relationships with his own peers. So John Quincy is among a lot of other people who are 18 and 19 years old who are being educated for the professions and for public life. And it does sound like he's writing adult to adult here, as Shelley suggests. Maybe not as much warmth, or maybe there's a kind of intimacy that comes from being fellow adults. So you're now sort of somebody I can address as a peer. None of these letters are about trivial things. Did he write trivial letters too? That's a good question. I don't think that they wrote a lot of trivial letters. I think John Adams was very much aware that he was writing about public life. He was writing about how to become a better person. I think John Adams was very much aware of letters as a form of teaching. And we saw that up until now. Now I think he's moving to letters as a form of exchange of ideas. But you're right. There's not a lot of trivial stuff here. Of course, I look at the ... the ellipsis, and I wonder what's not here. It could be that there are things that have been excised from these letters that are less weighty than what we see here. let's move to 1790, because now, where are these two men by 1790? John Adams, at this point, is Vice President of the United States, the first Vice President of the United States. He's in New York, which was the capital city of the United States in 1789 and 1790. His son, John Quincy, is now a lawyer in Boston. He's finished his degree at Harvard. He studied law for several years, and he's now set up his own practice in Boston. So we have, again, John and John Quincy in different places, both in major cities, and both now in public service or public life. And John writes to John Quincy, "Dear sir, if you meddle with political subjects, let me advise you to never lose sight of decorum. Assume a dignity above all personal reflections, and avoid as much as possible a party spirit. The true interest and honor of your country should be your only object, and you may be a terror to those evildoers to whom truth and falsehood are equally but sport, honor but a phantom, and their own insignificant importance their only objects. The hands of too many such creatures appear in some of the Boston newspapers. I am, with the tenderest affection, your father, John Adams." What does he mean by party here when he says avoid as much as possible a party spirit?
One participant writing politics with several exclamation points. Factions.
Exactly. This
Beginning
is
of political parties.
Exactly. And if we think about, for example, James Madison's Federalist Paper number 10, when Madison is warning about the dangers of political parties, we see a kind of general sense among many Americans at this time that political parties are a bad thing. When they're talking about political parties, and they often use the word faction interchangeably with the word party, the distinction they often drew was not like the one we have today. Today, we think about Democrats versus Republicans. We think about political parties as pretty much a standard feature of our political life. In 1789, 1790, things were quite different. And so when Adams contrasts a party spirit with the true interest and honor of your country, that's more typical. What people might write is, if I don't agree with you, then you are part of a party or part of a faction. I represent the true interest of the country, the public good, the general interest. A person would almost never identify himself or herself as belonging to a party. Instead, party was what you called the other guy, what you called your opponent. And so at this point, there's not a sense of, well, we have two parties, they're both legitimate. People would say, if you're part of a party, that's illegitimate. What's legitimate is thinking only about the public good, which must be me. So I think that's part of what's going on here. And I think that Dave makes the very good point that some of this almost sounds like the world that we live in today, that public figures are judged quickly, that there are evildoers to whom truth and falsehood are equally but sport, right? That it doesn't matter whether something's true or false, they just like having the debate. And that's what John Adams is warning about, what the newspapers bandy about, and so on.
Scott, what did they expect politics to be, though? I mean, Washington talks about factions in some of his letters to Jefferson and Hamilton, and in his farewell address too. Did they expect everybody to agree on everything? I mean, it's kind of an unrealistic image of politics, wouldn't it be?
I think it's completely unrealistic, and they knew it. Think about the world that they had lived through even in the last 4 or 5 years. Federalists versus anti-federalists arguing over whether to ratify the Constitution. The year before that in Massachusetts, Shays' Rebellion, or at least the people who didn't like it called it Shays' Rebellion, about debates, political debates and economic debates between Boston merchants and other fairly cosmopolitan citizens and farmers in Western Massachusetts. They knew that there were going to be debates over public issues, And in a sense, using the word party was a way to delegitimize your opponent, right? Calling your opponent partisan, calling your opponents a faction was a way to assert that you yourself represented something bigger than that, even if you didn't. And I think
Mhm.
that that's part of what's going on there. I think they knew that there would be divisions. What they didn't know in 1790, and I think this is the major difference between their day and even 50 years later, what they didn't know in 1790 was that there would be nationwide political parties, and that those nationwide political parties would exist at every level of government. That is, they would exist at the national level and in the presidency and Congress. They would exist at the state level as well. And that over time, there would be, say, a connection between Democrats in Massachusetts and Democrats in Congress. That's what they don't know at this point, because at this point, the United States is so far flung that communication between, say, Massachusetts and South Carolina still takes a long time. And the interests might be very different between Massachusetts and South Carolina. So they're living in a world in which factions might occur at the local level, but at the national level, it's harder to imagine those factions all coalescing into a party. That's really James Madison's point in Federalist 10. When James Madison talks about party in Federalist 10, he says that the larger the republic, the more the better chance you would be able to break and control the violence of factions, because it would be just so much harder for people who are part of a faction in South Carolina to get together with people in the same faction in Massachusetts. It's just a big country with lots of different interests. So that's how they thought about it. And that was a big difference between their day and ours. They didn't have a sense that there would be nationwide parties, at least not yet in 1790. This is going to be very different even within 6 or 7 years after that, when John Adams and Thomas Jefferson are rivals for the presidency.
We have a question. Did England have political parties at this time?
You bet it did. And those political parties were primarily within Parliament, and they were primarily, going back to the 1730s and 1740s, they were the parties of the prime minister and those who opposed the prime minister's policies. So yes, there were parties, and this was something that Americans thought they could rise above or get beyond. And we know something about how that turned out. Judith Batten asks an interesting question. Did Adams believe his ideas were the only ones that truly served the public interest? Yeah, I think it's fair to say that. I think that each of these, and we have the response, doesn't everyone? I think they did. And I think that Jefferson felt much the same way, that each of them thought that his ideas were in the larger public interest. And so the challenge is, how do you mediate between those? Can you mediate between them? Let's keep moving here. We are still in September 1790, and John is writing to John Quincy again. This is a follow-up letter. I wrote to you before today, but I forgot to say several things. Have you ever attended a town meeting? You may learn there the ways of men and penetrate several characters which otherwise you would not know. There are several objects of inquiry which I would point out to your consideration without making any noise or parade about them. What is a town meeting? Why would John Adams want his son to go to a town meeting?
Okay. Any takers on that question? Okay, we've got a number of people typing away feverishly here. And I see our two of our discussion questions touch on this. Is this an education for leading in Massachusetts? And is this an education for leading a republic? Okay, it is direct democracy at its finest, a town meeting. He wants them to learn about politics and know your constituency, where local decisions were made regarding town issues. And by going to one, John Quincy could learn about how government works.
Absolutely.
How do you respond to those?
absolutely right. And I think it's also worth noting that the town meeting was a New England phenomenon. You don't see town meetings typically in the southern states. You don't even see them to any great extent in the middle states, New York, Philadelphia. People lived far apart from each other, and there wasn't this kind of politics. The town meeting goes back to 17th century New England. So, in a sense, John Adams definitely wants his son to get to know the constituency and to know about politics. And it's a very regionally specific kind of politics that John Adams is sending his child, his son, to know. If we go on, this is the same letter, and this letter goes on for several slides. Now, John Adams continues the letter and says, here's what you can learn by going to a town meeting. Richard, you want to pick this one up here?
The state of parties and religion, government, manners, fashions, the leading characters in church and state, the machines, arts, and channels by which intelligence and reports are circulated through the town, the makers and spreaders of characters, the state of the various tradesmen and mechanics, their views, designs, and projects, the state, hopes, views, plans, passions, and sentiments of the old Tories and their correspondences abroad and at home in their own state and in other states, ditto the old Whigs of 1764 and 1774, ditto of the neutrals, ditto of those who have sprung up since the Revolution. Shall we go on?
Let's stick with these for a moment,
okay,
because we have, and we've put these into different colors to give a sense of the different topics that John Adams thinks that his son can learn at a town meeting. So the first two are about public life, right? So what are the state of parties in religion, government, manners, and fashion? By parties here, he probably means the different denominations, the different religious denominations in a community, the different political ideas, the governmental ideas people have, the different ways people act, manners and fashions, and then the leading characters in church and state, that is, the actors in those areas. So the first piece is these big public areas. The third and fourth, I think, are hilarious. He's telling his son, look at the people who are spreading news about other people. The machines, arts, and channels, that is, the machinations, the kind of ways in which people spread the news, circulate the news, and the people who are doing it. Watch out for those newspaper men. Look at the people who are spreading gossip. In other words, that's the second thing you can learn, how news spreads, how word gets around. The third piece that you find out here in number 5 is economics, right? The state of the various tradesmen and mechanics, their views, designs, and projects. So if number 1 and 2 are about religion and government, number 3 and 4 are about news, number 5 is about that world of people who make their livelihoods in economics, in trade. And then 6, 7, 8, and 9 are all about how the old divisions from the Revolution are still playing out 20 years later. That is, or not even 20 years later. So what do the people who were Tories, who were loyalists back in the 1770s and early 1780s, what are their ideas now? What are the ideas of the people who were Whigs, that is, the people who were patriots, revolutionaries? What about those who stayed neutral? And then those who sprung up since the Revolution, because there are plenty of people by 1790 who are out at this town meeting who were probably young children during the Revolution. So we have here John Adams thinking about people in a historical way, as well as what they do today. Moving forward, the rest of this letter, number 10, 11, and 12, the characters of all the clergymen of all denominations, physicians, surgeons, apothecaries, lawyers, and merchants of eminence, and shopkeepers, the foreigners in or out of office, French, English, Dutch, etc., the various combinations of all these. 13, 14, and 15, the state of diversions, amusements, spectacles, etc., the various clubs, lists of all which you should obtain, the buffoons, the merry andrews, the storytellers, the song singers, the mimics. These are all wheels, springs, cogs, or pins, some of them dirty ones, which compose the machine and make it go. Write me as often as possible. Don't show my letters. Yours, J.A. What do we see in these elements? 10, 11, and 12 are about all the other kinds of characters you're going to find here. So you're going to find clergymen, shopkeepers, etc. You're also going to find, potentially, people from a variety of ethnic backgrounds, various European ethnic backgrounds at a town meeting. 13, 14, and 15 are fun because it reminds us that town meetings weren't just about politics. They were local fun. They were where people went to enjoy some time together. Probably there was entertainment as well. And all of this is part of the society that makes up the machine that is society. We have Susan makes notes, it's an excellent list of the social classes, occupations present during this time period. Exactly so. Why does he say, don't show my letters?
Any takers on that one? He's been very careful about his own public character throughout these letters.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't want, he knows, we'll see later on, that he really gets skewered by the press. Perhaps he's afraid that the letters will give ammunition to his critical enemies.
I think that's right. I also think that Mike makes an important point here. These letters may offend constituents. There are certain things he says about people here that are not necessarily for public consumption, particularly because, as you point out, Susan, he's now Vice President of the United States. So his letters are no longer simply those of a father to a son. They are also letters of a national character, of the vice president, of the first vice president of the United States. And so he wants to draw a line between what's public and what's private. And as you will see in the letters ahead, he is becoming more and more worried about the politics behind this. This is just a month later. Actually, it's probably less than a month later. Richard, do you want to pick us up here with this one?
My dear son, the town of Boston is at present unhappily divided into political parties, and neither party, I presume, has tried experiments enough upon you to discover to which side you belong. You might very easily induce either side to make much of you by becoming a zealot for it. But my advice to you is nil admirari, nil contemni. Admire neither party, despise neither party. Treat both sides with civility and respect, but be the devotee of neither. Be always on the side of truth, justice, honor, virtue, and public spirit. I long to see you in your office, but the care of a troublesome removal to Philadelphia will prevent me until next year. Your letters give me so much pleasure as well as information that I wish you to write as often as you can to your affectionate John Adams.
The particular context here in the second paragraph is that the United States government was being moved from New York to Philadelphia at this time in late 1790, and it would be that Philadelphia would be the seat of the United States government for about 10 years until Washington, D.C. becomes the seat of government in 1800. And here we have John Adams, again, lamenting political parties and suggesting to his son, don't get embroiled with either one. Be civil and respectful to everybody, but don't get on the side of one or the other, because once you are associated with one political party or the other, there are going to be people who don't want to affiliate with you. There are going to be, you're going to make enemies. And so in a sense, he is suggesting to his son a way to stay neutral in a world where people are dividing into parties already by 1790. And at the national level by 1790, there are divisions about Alexander Hamilton's idea for a national bank, which is beginning to divide Alexander Hamilton, who's the Secretary of the Treasury, from Thomas Jefferson, who's the Secretary of State. Even within George Washington's cabinet, these divisions are emerging by late 1790. Mike makes the point that John Adams finally sounds affectionate. I think that's right. Write to me as often as you can. I get so much pleasure from your letters. I think we are seeing more and more affection between father and son is now 23 years old. And then John Quincy actually goes to a town meeting and reports to his father on what he has seen. Dear sir, I have attended town meeting, sir, and it was upon the occasion of the choice of representative for the district. I was indeed not a little diverted at the scene, and derived, I believe, some little instruction as well as entertainment from it. The real fact is that the new government is very rapidly acquiring a broad and solid foundation of popularity. It possesses, in my opinion, the confidence of the people in this state to a more eminent degree than any other government upon earth can boast of, and it appears to me to have already acquired a stability as astonishing as the revolution it has produced in the face of our affairs. John Quincy is going to a town meeting. It's only 2 years, a little more than 2 years after Massachusetts ratified the Constitution. Massachusetts ratified the Constitution in the middle of 1788. And in Massachusetts, the ratification of the Constitution was very, very close and very, very contentious. So what John Quincy is suggesting here is that, at least in his view, as he sees the town meeting, just 2 years after that great division over the Constitution, people have come together. People have come together around the United States' new government, a broad and solid foundation of popularity, which might not have been expected just 2 years earlier when some people were still quite bitter about the ratification of the Constitution. This letter continues. The effects of that revolution, that is the creation of the new government, are already felt in a very high degree in this part of the country. Our commerce is increasing and extending, our manufacturers are multiplying very rapidly, our agriculture flourishing, industry has resumed the place which it had resigned for some time to idleness and luxury, and is seldom without employ. I am informed that the mechanics of almost every description in this town are at present more constantly busy than they have been at any period since the Revolution. The farmer, the tradesman, the mechanic, and the merchant are all so mutually dependent upon one another for their prosperity that I really know not whether most to pity the ignorance or lament the absurdity of the partial politicians who are constantly erecting an imaginary wall of separation between them. John Quincy is here suggesting the economy's good. People are thriving, people are flourishing, and it's only those party politicians, partial politicians, who are trying to set people against each other in order to win an election. So John Quincy is suggesting, in a sense, we should all of these people should become more cognizant of how dependent they are on one another, and then there wouldn't be party politics at all, because we would all understand that we all share in this common good. And that's a kind of federalist idea, that we all have this mutually connected society, and if the tradesman and the merchant and the mechanic are doing well, are prosperous, that will be good for everyone.
If I might jump in here, Scott, you mentioned the federalist sense of the connectedness of society. That takes us to one of our the first question in the form. What can we learn from the letters about both Adams' federalist ideologies and their thoughts on the duties of citizens of the new republic? So that is a federalist idea that appears here, this kind of interconnectedness of society. If we were to tease out federal ideology, we could look at that in these letters.
I think so. I also think that the Federalists they tend to be interested in the development of commerce and a mercantile elite. What will become known as the Democratic Republicans, the party that's associated with Thomas Jefferson, becomes more associated with not just farmers, but also kind of ordinary working class people in cities like New York and Philadelphia. I think what you see here is an emphasis on commerce. What we don't see in this letter that's also part of a Federalist worldview is a kind of idea about leadership by an educated elite. The Federalists are much more concerned about the ordinary folk becoming powerful and prominent in government, whereas the Democratic Republicans of Thomas Jefferson are more willing to grant the idea that the ordinary farmer has a kind of political intelligence as well.
So we may not have seen, had Jefferson been writing that letter about the town meeting, we may not have seen some of the comments that Adams made. I mean, the tone of the thing would have been a little bit, less condescending, perhaps.
Perhaps so, quite possibly so. Not that Jefferson was a common man by any stretch of the imagination, but Jefferson. The other thing that distinguishes Jefferson from the Adamses is that the Adamses are very much citizens of the city, whereas Jefferson is much more has much more of a sense that farmers are the core of America's identity and the core and the foundation of a republican government, that farmers have the kind of independence that allows them to be thoughtful citizens. Adams and the Adamses, having much more experience in urban life, have much more of a sense that these the tradesmen, the mechanics, and the merchants are also parts of the political body. Let's move on, because I'm aware that we are closing in on the end of our time. The next several letters get us into the kind of political battles that are going on, and we'll just read some of the bold-faced parts here. It's now 1792. The election of 1792 is over. Washington and Adams have been re-elected as president and vice president. And John Quincy writes, as to the general measures of the federal government, when I have seen them attacked artfully and insidiously, as has frequently been the case, I have often thought of defending them, but as often have concluded that my assistance could not be necessary and could be but feeble. By this point, there really are distinct factions or views running through the national government. By this point, I believe Jefferson, if he hasn't already resigned as Secretary of State, he will soon do so. I think he steps down in 1793. And John Quincy is saying, the federal government is being attacked, and I want to step up and defend it, but maybe I shouldn't. Maybe I should just keep myself in the background. And he goes on in this letter to say, the government, I suppose, needed it not. In other words, it wouldn't help the government much for me to step up and argue in favor of it. And as to my own advancement, I could really see nothing in public life but what it was my object to avoid. I have been really apprehensive of becoming politically known before I could establish a professional reputation. I knew that my independence and consequently my happiness in life depended upon this, and I have sincerely wished to remain in the shade rather than to appear as a politician without any character as a lawyer. I have to make my reputation as a lawyer, as a professional man, before I can go participating in an increasingly factious and increasingly contentious politics. And so he's saying, in a sense, I need to slow down at least a little bit. I can't jump into politics yet. I need to develop my own public character as an attorney, as a reputable person, as somebody whom people respect, well before I can become part of political life. The last letter that we want to show you tonight is this one in 1793. John Quincy Adams is now 26 years old. His father is still the Vice President of the United States, and I think this is in some ways a touching letter because of its last paragraph. And so John is writing to John Quincy, Dear Sir, Congress have received from the President all the negotiations with France and England, as well as those with the Indians. On Monday, we expect those with Spain and all the intelligence received respecting the Algerines. In other words, he's talking about international politics here, but look at that last paragraph. For myself, my race is almost run. You have a long career before you, and I am happy to observe that you have not accommodated your opinions nor sentiments to the momentary fashions of the present times, but have searched for principles which will be more durable. I am affectionately, J.A. And Kelly writes, that last paragraph seems like a farewell letter to his son. It does, doesn't it? It feels as though John Adams is saying, I'm almost through with my public life. Yours is going forward, and yours will be much longer. How old is John Adams at this point? John Adams is 58 years old. At 58, he's probably thinking that he could die at any point. Life expectancy was not nearly as long as then as it is now. 58 was still a fairly old man, and so he might be thinking, I don't have much longer to go. He doesn't know, of course, that he will live for almost 33 years more. He doesn't know yet that he still has a presidency ahead of him. He imagines that perhaps it's John Quincy whose life and career stretch out into the future. Mike Cesario says John Adams calls his son Sir. A very good point. We have a kind of baton being passed. He recognizes his son as Sir. I also love the fact that he signs his initials here instead of his full name. There's a kind of intimacy in that now they are on this kind of different basis. And I think that suggests the change that has occurred over time as John Quincy has grown into a respected and respectable man of his own. I want to turn back to that one question from the forum that we haven't gotten to yet. Richard, do we have time to just address that question about John Adams as an afterthought to Thomas Jefferson and George Washington?
Certainly. Fire away.
I like that question a lot. And I think these letters tell us something. You will not find Thomas Jefferson writing letters like this to his children because his children were all girls. And I think that what we see in these letters between John and John Quincy is an idea about fathers passing down ideas about leadership and education to their sons that you won't see in Jefferson. You don't see nearly as much of it in Washington either. Washington, George and Martha Washington, of course, had no children of their own. There were Martha Washington's children and then her grandchildren, and George tries to be a kind of surrogate father to them, but it's not the same as John and John Quincy. The level of the degree of closeness we see here, and also the degree of just literacy, the fact that this is a family that writes to each other. The letters between John and Abigail are similarly wonderful and literate and dealing with public affairs. So I think something we can take away from this is that John Adams, as a historical figure, gives us a lot of documentary meat to work with. Great stuff for teaching, I'd say. The other big difference is that John and John Quincy Adams are New Englanders, and they are basically Bostonians. They are citizens of cities, and they're citizens of the world. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson are both Virginia planters, and that makes them different. And we can therefore think about different aspects of the early American leadership by thinking about the Adamses in contrast to Washington and Jefferson. Do others have ideas about that? Thoughts, ideas?
Any comments, questions to wrap things up? Someone asked earlier about accurate information about Adams, Passionate Sage by Joseph Ellis. We also had a comment that you don't see on the chat right now about a comparison between George H.W. and George W. Bush. It would be interesting to see if they shared letters like this and if George H.W. was in any way grooming George W. for leadership in the way John Adams groomed John Quincy.
It's a wonderful question, and I think that this could be a great thing to explore with students because students, might have at least some familiarity with George W. Bush as president and thinking about changes in father-son relationships over time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I see we're getting a few last shots coming in. Please let me remind you to use the form to continue this discussion and to share fresh approaches and questions. We'll monitor the form until November 27th, and what that means is that when a question comes in, we will pass it on to Scott, and we will get back in touch with you. Scott, let me thank you for a wonderful seminar. I mean, you really brought John Adams and John Quincy to life and gave us a great deal of insight, not only between a father and a son, but also on leadership in the New Republic. Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much. It's been a lot of fun, and I've learned through this conversation as well. Thanks for all your thoughts and comments in the chat room.
I want to thank our participants as well. As always, we had a lot of really good chat, and that really helped to make the seminar much richer and insightful. Ladies and gentlemen, please check americainclass.org for our upcoming webinars. On November 6th, we'll be looking at the birthmark and Rappaccini's daughter, Hawthorne's mad scientist. So join us for that, and please spread the good news about that seminar to your English teacher colleagues. And then both your English teachers and our history teachers can join us on November 13th when we look at Thoreau's civil disobedience. Go to the home page, please, of this seminar. Take that evaluation, knock it back to us so that we can give you that certificate of participation. And so this evening, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll join us again. And this evening, I'm going to say good night. Thank you.